Today we'll be discussing Book 8 of Plato's Republic. At this point in the Republic, Plato has completed his account of the philosopher king. He now returns to the argument that he broke off in Book 5. There, he had suggested that in addition to the perfectly just city and the character type corresponding to it, which we now know to be the philosophical type, that there were four main alternative types of city and four additional corresponding character types. This is the subject of Book 8. The discussion of the four character types, or the additional four character types, the four in addition to the philosopher, and their associated types of constitution, or four additional forms of socio-political organization above and beyond the aristocracy in which the philosopher kings rule, which is supposedly the best city. There are two unique features to Plato's mode of socio-political analysis. The first and the more fundamental is the methodological approach of what we might call macro-micro parallelism. I won't write this down because this is just a term I came up with. It's not a canonical term, it's not a Platonic term, but it's a useful way to think about Plato's mode of analysis. So micro-macro parallelism, you probably already have an inkling of what I'm getting at here. That is to say that the constitution of the individual soul at the micro or the psychological level is going to determine the constitution of the polis, of the city, or state, the country, the society at the macro level. This is, first of all, an apparent conviction that, as we might put it, character is destiny. Character is political destiny, specifically. We might think here of Ben Franklin's famous remark after he was asked at the closing of the Constitutional Convention what kind of government they had devised, and he remarked, "A republic if you can keep it." You may have heard that. And that idea, republic if you can keep it, is that the best devised constitution in human history isn't going to be stable, isn't going to last, if the people that are in charge of applying that constitution to everyday life lack the inner constitution to be able to do that. That is, if they lack the inner virtue to be republicans in this case, republican with a small r, of course. So character is political destiny in that sense. But this is also a conviction, I think, about the causal influence of growing up under a certain constitution on a person's character. A democratic constitution, for instance, produces a certain type of person. It reflects a certain type of person, but it also produces a certain type of person. So there's kind of a mutual reinforcement or feedback mechanism. Constitution, the political constitution, reflects the psychological constitution, we might say, of the citizens. And those citizens' psychological constitution, their outlook, their worldview, is in turn shaped by the political constitution or the social environment in which they're raised. So that's the first dimension of Plato's mode of socio-political analysis, this micro-macro parallelism. The second is a dialectical theory of socio-political decadence. And dialectical here is, of course, an important term for Plato, a Platonic term. It refers to the back and forth, specifically, in an argument. And for Plato, generally speaking, a dialectic has a kind of positive effect. It builds up to a more adequate theory, or in his view, it builds up to the fundamental principles of reality, ultimately, if you pursue it far enough. More and more adequate definitions that provide a clearer and clearer vision of the forms of things and so forth. But I'm thinking of dialectical here rather in a devolutionary sense. That is to say that there's certain seeds in every constitution that lead it to devolve into a less good constitution. That is, there's a kind of internal contradiction. This elicits thoughts of Georg Hegel's much later idea of dialectical development of culture. But I think we see this anticipated quite clearly in Plato, where the aristocracy, for example, contains the seeds of devolution, of decay, you might say, into a timocracy or an honor-loving constitution. And the timocracy, in turn, contains seeds of devolution into an oligarchy, and so on down the line. So that is to say, there's a kind of conflict that leads to a resolution with a lower level of society as the result. A kind of reverse mirror image or inverse image of Plato's idea of the ascent through dialectic to the forms. Excuse me. And so this is the basic idea that he has. The 5 types of constitution that he will discuss are aristocracy, timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. And in each of these cases, we have a corresponding character type. We have the philosopher, the honor lover, the money lover, the freedom lover, and the tyrant, who is the complete lawless type. And so in each of these cases, there's going to be something within the Constitution that leads it to be reduced to something less good until finally we reach the worst state of all, which is tyranny. And this ends up being ultimately a rather pessimistic picture. Perhaps you might even say a cynical picture of the way in which human society seems inevitably doomed to ultimate failure. So we might reflect upon that and what it means. Plato is silent on this issue. But his principle is, as he says in 544d, page 370 in the left-hand column, there must be as many forms of human character as there are of constitutions. The rationale for this is simple and basically obvious. Constitutions do not arise from oak or rock, as he says, but from the characters of the people in the cities. That is, once a certain character type becomes common enough, a tipping point is reached, and the majority will set the socio-political agenda for the entire populace, and even influence thereafter the character of the entire populace. We might think of the example of Nazi Germany as quite a clear case of this. Certainly in, let's say, 1929, the majority of Germans weren't Nazis. They didn't think like Nazis. But a mere, let's say, 5 or 6 years later, it seems that they were. And so how did that happen? How did that come about? Of course, here you're dealing with the particular aspects of a totalitarian regime and its unrelenting use of state power to enforce their ideology. But of course, this is also Plato's image of the aristocracy, his aristocracy, which would be a totalitarian arrangement or close to it. So the character type in this sense is going to be the one that comes to be the paradigm in a particular city and to set the agenda. The first step of Plato's analysis is to examine how the aristocracy degenerates into a timocracy. That is to say, a constitution that's focused on honor-loving, victory-loving. I think nowadays we might naturally associate this with a kind of militaristic society, perhaps best reflected in the modern era by regimes like the German Empire, the Germany of the late 19th, early 20th century, or of Imperial Japan, as regimes that were sort of built around an ideology of victory and honor above all else. The general principle for the change in the Constitution is first articulated page 370 in the left here. in the right-hand column rather. He says, in all constitutions, change originates in the ruling element itself when faction breaks out within it. But that if this group remains of one mind, then however small it is, change is impossible. So this seems to be a general point he wants to make here, that in any society that's got any degree of stability, you've got a ruling class. And the society will remain stable as long as the ruling class remains united. Once it becomes divided, once faction breaks out, the regime is threatened. And this, incidentally, speaking of the writers of the American Constitution, this is one of their great worries, one of their great concerns, which, of course, in spades came into reality and still continues to be a reality, that faction would weaken and divide and ultimately undermine the republic. And so this is what Plato is articulating here, that as long as the ruling class remains united, notice the people have to remain united necessarily. I mean, of course, it would be better if the people were united. But as long as the ruling class remains united, they, of course, can impose their will on the people, on the masses. It's when the ruling class becomes disunited, becomes at loggerheads with each other on one issue or another, that the city's stability, the constitution's stability is threatened. So the question becomes, how factions arise in the city? How do factions arise in the city or in the state or in the country, as we would say nowadays? Where do these factions come from? And at this point, Plato's account takes a bizarre turn into numerology, supposing that the dissolution of aristocracy will come about due to the failure to mate during periods of good fertility and infertility. He gives a fantastical and absurdly complex calculation to explain which are the inauspicious times for conceiving children. And it's difficult to make sense of this. So one observation about this is that it illustrates the importance, the weight that Plato places on his eugenics ideas, why he devoted so much time to discussing this, because he considers it to be of the first importance, that the philosopher kings are basically bred in the proper way, so that they are they're going to inherit the right qualities to be a philosopher from their parents who have these qualities. But there are problems about this issue here. For one thing, if it's possible to determine auspicious and inauspicious times for mating in this way, why did Socrates not prescribe this as a requirement of the eugenics practices that the guardians have to follow to begin with? Why isn't this part of the account? More reasonably, I think, this elaborate numerical calculation that he gives here should be taken as a kind of myth that explains the difficult and obscure nature of human reproduction. Today, perhaps we'd simply explain the eventual dissolution of the city by pointing out that random genetic mutation can thwart even the most carefully planned eugenics program, I should say. But of course, there are other issues here that he could have mentioned that he didn't, things that could upset the perfection of a perfect aristocracy if such a thing were ever to come into existence. And the number one thing here is just nature generally, natural disasters, plagues, a volcano erupting in the neighborhood of the city, and wiping out crops. Of course, just the chaos of history. Even the best put together republic is vulnerable to some larger, more powerful empire, the Mongols or whatever, sweeping in and sweeping them away. And so Plato doesn't mention that, though. He mentions this strange numerological account. But I think that what he's recognizing here is that even in the best of circumstances, no eugenics program is going to be able to always produce the ideal people. And so you're going to run into this problem of a less than perfect meritocracy that always bedevils human political arrangements. As much as we, strive, especially in the modern era, to have a meritocracy, there's always going to be nepotism. There's always going to be people, lucking into roles that they really aren't well suited for. And so that's essentially the essential problem that he's imagining here. Plato imagines that the beginning of the dissolution of aristocracy will come about when genetically unworthy guardians come to power and begin to slacken the requirements for musical and physical training. The guardians will become more unmusical. They will become to lack this ineffable quality of grace that we referred to earlier. They'll lack that certain je ne sais quoi that makes a guardian an appropriate guardian. And so, as a result, they won't be able to discern and segregate the gold, silver, and bronze souls in the city. And iron, he refers to Hesiod here. And as a consequence, there'll be a mixing of these natures in the ruling class. And this is what I was referring to a minute ago, that natures that aren't really suited to rule, these bronze and iron natures will come into power. And Socrates suggests that mixed natures will give rise to disharmony within the ruling class. At the first stage, a portion of the ruling class will break off and will, quote, this is at 372 in the left on our text, they will, quote, pull the Constitution toward the acquisition of land, houses, gold, and silver, unquote. Well, another part will remain loyal to virtue in the old political system. You can see what the idea is here, that it takes a particular type of person just to live this sort of communal, this really communistic life of the guardians. And if someone that doesn't have that kind of nature that is, as it were, too soft, or too money-loving by nature, loves luxuries and comforts, and that's just sort of the way their soul is, if such a person ascends to the guardian class, and the guardians are unable to discern and to separate out that person and segregate them and send them back down to where they belong, to the money-making classes, then you're going to get these factions within the guardian class between those people who say, hey, why do we have to live in these barracks? Why can't we have houses like everyone else? And then the people who say, no, this is the way that we've always done it. This is part of our Constitution. We have to respect the old ways. And then those two factions will fight it out, those who want more money and those who don't. And the resulting factionalism will result in compromising the aristocratic constitution. Plato suggests, or Socrates suggests, that in some respects, especially military, the constitution remains stable, or will remain stable, or would remain stable under this sort of circumstance. However, with a faction devoted to love of money, the truly wise no longer rule, I should say. Such people are afraid of producing wise rulers. And so spirited and simple people who are naturally suited more for war than peace come to be favored as rulers. You can see if there's a conflict between those guardians who want the right to acquire money, wealth, material possessions, and those who want to respect a more Spartan lifestyle. If they come into a conflict, often what happens when you have factions that are in conflict with one another, compromises get made. And so you're going to have the compromise typically is going to be what both of them can agree on. So if the money lovers don't like these people who have all these fancy philosophical ideals, and the more philosophical type of guardians don't like these people who are money grubbers, at least they both can agree that spirited people, that is to say people who love honor and victory and so on, are good people. And so they settle on those type of people who become the rulers. And thus the spirited element masters the city, Plato writes. And the city becomes characterized above all by love of victory and honors. And so we get the transition from this aristocratic form of government to a timocratic form of government, more of an honor and victory loving. Socrates describes the type of person who's favored by the timocratic constitution. This is at the top left-hand column of page 373. So this is the timocratic man, the honor-loving man. He would have to be more stubborn and less well-trained in music. A lover of music and of listening, yet not at all skilled in speaking. A sort of person who is harsh to slaves instead of looking down on them as an adequately educated person does. Gentle to free people and very submissive to rulers. A lover of ruling and of honor, who does not base his claim to rule on his ability to speak or anything like that, but on his exploits in war and anything having to do with war, a lover of physical training and of hunting. This is, sort of our stereotype of the man's man. This is the man of few words. This is the man of action. He lets his deeds do the talking for him. He doesn't give flowery speeches, but rather he just points to the deeds that he has performed. Look, I conquered this territory for the city. I defeated this invading army. This is why I should, be honored. And that's what they're concerned with. And we see here in this description how this person still shares some of the characteristics of the ideal guardian, but it's beginning to erode. Socrates adds that such a person, who also shares in the money lover's nature, comes to love money more and more as he grows older. So this is clearly this kind of a compromise figure, an intermediate figure. And, it's natural to see how such a person could come to favor money, because this person thinks, well, money is sort of like the prize that reflects the honor that is due to me. You honor someone by giving them a great estate or whatever to, rule over. And so they come to, naturally, of course, from the perspective of loving honor and victories. But as they get older and their victories, you might say, become less and less attainable because of their greater feebleness, they gradually drift more into this money-loving arena. Now, the Timocratic type, as with all the types, we notice in Plato's account that he begins all of these types in youth. I mean, his analysis begins by showing how this youth arises and comes to be this particular type. And so the Timocratic type is no exception to this. This type begins to develop in youth. As Socrates describes it, he comes to be swayed in his youth by his mother, servants, and other people who criticize his father for despising money. We're imagining this person, the first Timocratic youth, and so this person has a philosopher father. But people around him who are not philosophers grumble that he's not paying enough attention to money. And on the other hand, this type of youth, to the Timocratic youth, will listen to his father, who presumably tries to inculcate the superior value of knowledge and virtue over money. And as a result, Plato writes, page 373, around 550b, he says he compromises on a middle way when he is pulled in these two directions. So he's pulled towards the father's love for philosophical matters, and also to the mother's urging, and of course the mother's in charge of managing the household, and is complaining that the father isn't concerned with money. Of course, in this account, you sort of wonder what happened to Plato's ideal aristocracy, where everyone lives communally and they don't have single spouses and so on. So evidently now he's kind of switched to describing a later stage. The city has already devolved from the perfect aristocracy, or maybe it never reached it. This is only a kind of second best approximation to the ideal, because people are described here as having, nuclear families, so to speak. But anyway, leaving that issue to aside, it says he's pulled in these two directions and surrenders the rule within him to the middle element, the victory-loving and the spirited one, and becomes a proud and honor-loving man. So he's torn between the philosophical element on the one side, the money-loving element on the other side, as like a pendulum swinging back and forth, and he compromises in the middle and becomes an honor-loving and spirited man, which shares a little bit of the philosophical nature, because it's high-minded and disdains, the grubby concern for materialism. But on the other hand, it shares something of the money-loving nature, because it's concerned with sort of competition and winning at the material plane, so to speak, within the cave, to use that metaphor. So this is how the Timocratic youth results. Next is the Oligarchy Constitution. And Socrates defines this one as follows. On page 374 in the upper left-hand column, the Constitution based on a property assessment, the one in which the rich rule and the poor man does not participate in ruling. Today, such a system would often be described as a plutocracy, or a rule by the wealthy. Plato has Socrates argue that the accumulation of private wealth in a timocracy eventually destroys a constitution that's based upon love of victory and honors and replaces it with one based upon love of money. So we get, instead of, let's say, the kind of militaristic society or state that was associated with Imperial Japan or with Imperial Germany, maybe something more like the Dutch Republic or the British Empire, a state that's basically built around commerce and enriching the city. Plato implies that the love of victories and competition transfers to what today we might call conspicuous consumption. So the wealthy timocrats see their neighbors spending lavishly on luxuries of various sorts, and their inborn competitive instinct spurs them to try to do the same, to try to outdo their neighbor, like billionaires competing with each other to have the world's largest motor yacht. Eventually, the chief honors in the city are won by whomever is the richest. Displays of wealth come to be valued more than displays of virtue. Ultimately, the supreme value in the city becomes money-making, and the Constitution, the laws, and the customs come to reflect that fact. That is, to reflect the money-making or money-loving character of leading citizens. Socrates suggests that the pure money-making type arises from a son who sees his father become disgraced and disenfranchised due to some political intrigues. Think of the fate of House Stark in Game of Thrones, for those of you who perhaps are fans of that series. The son sees his father become disgraced and disenfranchised due to political intrigues, which are always going to occur when you have factions. And so some father ends up on the losing side of some political battle and ends up having his property confiscated, ends up having his status taken away. And the son says, and maybe the son recognizes that the reason for this was that those people who had more wealth, as is often the case in all societies, including modern ones, that those people who have the more wealth get their way because they're able to buy elections, for example. And so what does such a person think? Well, such a person is going to conclude, after seeing and experiencing all that, as Socrates says, page 376 in our text, in the very top of the left-hand column, after seeing and experiencing all that and losing his property, the son is afraid, I imagine, and immediately throws the honor-loving and spirited element headlong from the throne in his own soul. And humbled by poverty, he turns greedily to money-making, and little by little, saving and working, he amasses property. Don't you think that someone like that will then establish the appetitive and money-making element on that throne and make it a great king within himself, adorned with golden tiaras and collars and Persian swords? And we see here very much, this sounds like, reads like the origin story of many a villain. When an author is trying to make the villain character somewhat more sympathetic, they might give them this backstory about how their family was unjustly treated. And so, as a youth, this future villain resolved, this is never going to happen to me. And so they became just a ruthless pursuer of the thing that they felt would ensure that it would never happen to them. And in this example, of course, this is money. So the idea is this person thinks, well, look where all his love of honor got dad. I'm never going to be so foolish as to make that mistake. I'm always going to be rich so I can bribe people when necessary and never have this happen to me. That's the way in which this honor lover comes to have a money-loving son. That's the way Plato is imagining it. Now, the mark of an oligarchic constitution, a plutocratic constitution, the mark of this is the passing of a law that establishes a wealth qualification for participation in ruling. As he describes on page 374 in the right-hand column towards the top. And this, again, is something that historically was part of the American Constitution, that you have to own property to be able to vote. So you had to have a certain degree of wealth in order to be able to vote. And this is why, in the minds of the founding fathers, as many of you might know, of America, America was not founded as a democracy, but as a republic. Plato would say it was founded as an oligarchy. It was not founded to be, it was founded to be ruled by those landed planters in the South and those, wealthy merchants and the professional class in the Northeast, and was not intended to be a democracy by any means. The oligarchic city breaks decisively with the character of the aristocratic city. So, while the honor-loving city, the timocracy, still reflected to some extent the ideals and values of the aristocracy, once we get down to the oligarchy, here, the last vestiges of the aristocratic ideal are really more or less overturned for Plato. And oligarchy comes to be on a completely different basis. Because in the oligarchic city, it's not the best, but it's the wealthiest who rule. Socrates likens this to selecting a captain to a ship, or I should say a captain for a ship, selecting a captain for a ship, but not on the basis of who is most talented or experienced at seamanship, but rather on the basis of who is the wealthiest. In this situation, the quality of leadership, of course, will inevitably go down. In addition, such a city is not one city, but two. It's divided into the haves and the have-nots. And these are inevitably going to be plotting against one another. You're going to have this problem that we hear of so often in our own age, the problem of income inequality, the problem of the 1% versus the 99%. These are two cities divided against one another that are inevitably going to be wary about one another and about one another's motives, and are going to be plotting against each other. And in a war, the rulers will have to call on the majority who are opposed to them, or else to hire mercenaries. But since they're unwilling to spend the money, because they're stingy, they will be unwilling to hire mercenaries, and so they're going to have an unmotivated army. Again, in history, we see examples, perhaps the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example, in the First World War, had to rely upon an army that wasn't necessarily all that enthusiastic about serving the rulers. So these are the two major weaknesses or defects of the oligarchy. There's poor leadership on the one hand, unqualified leadership, and on the other hand, internal division that renders this kind of city markedly weaker than both the aristocracy and the timocracy because of its internal divisions and its unqualified leadership. In addition, the oligarchy will be the first to allow unrestricted buying and selling, including the complete selling out of one's assets. One is allowed to go all in betting everything on the stock market or whatever. And this makes it possible for a person to go bankrupt and yet remain a citizen, which in turn promotes the growth of criminal enterprises, as these people, who Socrates terms the drones, drawing an analogy with the bees in a hive, they have to exist as parasites in the city. And so they're going to have to, earn their bread somehow, and if they don't earn it, they'll steal it. And so you get the rise of crime in an oligarchic city as an offshoot of wealth inequality. Now, in oligarchic character, the money-loving character still displays a semblance of virtue, but it's not because he loves virtue or virtuous behavior, which was a mark of both the aristocrat and, to some extent, the honor lover. They love virtue and virtuous behavior for its own sake. And this is not the case for an oligarch. The oligarch could care less about virtuous behavior, except to the extent that he's afraid of getting a bad reputation and of losing his possessions as a result. So, Socrates says, page 376 in the right-hand column, So doesn't that make it clear that in other contractual matters where someone like that has a good reputation and is thought to be just, something good of his is forcibly holding in check the other bad appetites within, not persuading them that they had better not, nor taming them by a word, but using compulsion and fear because he is terrified of losing his other possessions? Why isn't the oligarch himself a thief and a bad man? Well, because he's afraid of losing his reputation and therefore not being able to do business in the city, or perhaps even being exiled from the city. And it's that keeps him in check. So it's purely fear that keeps him in check. It's not desire or love that keeps him in check. It's not desire or love for virtue, but just fear of the punishments that would result if he is found out as the vicious man that at heart he really is. So the oligarchic man then is just as internally divided as the oligarchic city is. Again, there's this parallel. In the city oligarchy, it's because of the wealth inequality. There's a division between the haves and have-nots, between the rich and the poor. And then within the soul of the characteristic type of the city, namely the money lover, there's also a division, and this is sort of a division between the inner and outer, between the outward appearance that such a person has to present to the world and the inner reality of what he's really like inside. So this person is always fronting. He's always putting on some false front to convince people that he's really virtuous, when in fact all he wants is money. And it just so happens that pretending to be virtuous is the most efficient way for him to get money. That's the way Plato is imagining it. Next to be considered is democracy. Where does democracy come from? Well, the change from oligarchy to democracy comes about when greedy rulers extend credit to young people on interest. And in order to make money off them, they encourage them to spend more and more borrowed money. Does this sound familiar? Credit card stands on campus, right? Lots of free quote unquote loan money to acquire college debt and so forth. Low interest mortgages and so forth. This is the source of the change from oligarchy to democracy. So we see here a quite clear case of, once again, I should say, we saw it in the other examples as well, though I didn't point it out explicitly, but here it's crystal clear that the very thing that's at the core of the Oligarchy Constitution, namely this insatiable lust for wealth, comes to be the undermining and the undoing of the Oligarchy Constitution, because it's because they can't help themselves, and because they're so overly greedy that they end up hatching schemes to get the young to borrow more and more money and to encourage them to be consumers, unrestrained consumers, fond of luxury, incapable of any either mental or physical effort, too soft to endure pleasures or pains, and lazy. This is the result, right? So there's this oligarchic society encourages people, spend all your time on the internet watching, YouTube videos, watching the advertising, being induced to buy the stuff that they want you to buy in the advertising, and then, ordering the stuff online. And how do you pay for it? Well, you just sign up for another credit card. What's this? Credit card number 15? Well, they're giving me the credit, right? And of course, this is not something that is sustainable. And this promotes intemperance in the city, the vice of intemperance. You cannot honor wealth and maintain temperance in the city at the same time. This is the principle that you see Plato expressing. You cannot honor wealth and maintain temperance in the city at the same time. Because, of course, to accumulate wealth, one needs to encourage consumption. And now, there's a bit of a conflict. I just note here as a footnote, because he also imagines that the money-loving type of person is the type of person who is stingy or thrifty, because he's like Ebenezer Scrooge or Scrooge McDuck in the Disney cartoons, Remember Scrooge McDuck, who likes his swimming pool full of gold doubloons that he likes to dive into. So there is that type of person. But now we're imagining that such a person who wants to just accumulate more and more will have to come up with new schemes for making money. And this is going to require this kind of conflict because someone's going to have to be giving them this money. And so they have to encourage some kind of consumption as well on the other side. And of course, it's natural to think that the way this will divide out is between the older generation being the ones who are hoarding the money and the younger generation being the ones who are consuming. So what will be the disposition of these young people when they finally have to pay the piper, when the chickens finally come home to roost and they go bankrupt from this? When they're milling around the city in a state of destitution due to the policies of the rulers? Well, basically, the ancient Greek version of Occupy Wall Street, Antifa, BLM, this is what happens, according to Plato. You have a bunch of young people who are broke, who feel resentful at basically having been left with nothing but a barrel to wear and suspenders by these rich financial interests. And so what happens? And these people sit around in the city, I suppose, armed with stings or weapons, some of them in debt. Think of all these BLM, Antifa, Occupy Wall Street members who are loaded down with student debt and credit card debt. Some disenfranchised. Again, think especially of BLM, the claims of disenfranchisement. Hating and plotting against those who have acquired their property and all the others as well. Hating and plotting against those who have acquired their property, like the demand for reparations. And passionately longing for revolution. In such a situation, the poor have no reason to look up to or respect the rich. There's no honor due to the rich anymore. In this situation, the city very easily divides into factions, not just factions that are different political factions, but factions that will actually make war on each other. And so this creates a situation for civil war. And if the poor win a civil war against the rich, they will kill or expel the defeated class and give everyone an equal share in the Constitution and the ruling offices, perhaps by selecting them by lot. And here we get the Constitution of democracy, which is characterized as the most freedom-loving constitution, the freedom and equality-loving, which go hand in hand in the way Plato thinks of it, because the freedom is the freedom for letting 1,000 flowers bloom, the greatest possible diversity, the greatest sort of multicolored society is the democratic society. It's like CHOP or CHAZ or whatever it was called in Seattle, the autonomous zone, where everyone's a ruler. Everyone can do whatever just do their thing, whatever they want to do whatever weird, lifestyle they want to engage in, and no one cares. It's all good. That's democracy. That's true democracy. And so these are related properties. It's diverse. He says, just like an embroidered cloak with every kind of ornament stuck to it. It's diverse because of the license that's allowed in a democratic society. Anything goes. And so democratic cities are characterized by their tolerance, even for crime. Laws go unenforced in a democratic city. Think of, Portland. There is no such thing as law in Portland. You just do whatever you want. If there are enough of you and you've got a political slogan attached to what you're doing, you can get away with it. Even convicted criminals are allowed to walk free. Again, Portland. People who riot, they might get arrested, but then they're immediately released and nothing happens. That's democracy. So how does the democratic type arise? Well, he says the democratic type of man arises when a boy is brought up with an oligarchic father. The father is money-loving, but for that reason, he's also thrifty and reputation conscious. And the son is raised by his father to restrain the unnecessary appetites in him, the spendthrift ones that don't make money. So you have the image here of kind of the, traditional petite bourgeois parent who wants their kid to get a practical, education, go into business or the professions or something like that, and learn to discipline his desires so he can have a fat retirement account when he gets old and so forth, that kind of thing. But however, as we've already seen in the oligarchy city, he's going to live in a city filled with drones, these wild and terrible creatures who can provide multifarious pleasures of every degree of complexity and sort. So the son, he goes to college and he discovers the local campus weed dealer, is basically what Plato's imagining here. And due to this weed dealer on campus, he runs the risk of being seduced away from the self-restraint of his father. I was going to go to class and then I got high or whatever. That's the picture. So the son becomes internally divided between his lawful and lawless internal tendencies. I'd like to make dad proud of me and get good grades. On the other hand, I'd really like to smoke another bowl. And sometimes the lawless side wins and he becomes a hippie, a democratic type. In the end, the democratic type is characterized above all by his tendency to self-indulgence. Plato says, quote, putting his pleasures on an equal footing, he lives always surrendering rules over to himself to whichever desire comes along as if it were chosen by lot, unquote. Right? So this is this kind of just go with the flow attitude towards life. Wake up, what do I feel like doing today? And wherever the whim leads you, you become this free spirit. This is what I'm going to do. Namely, what's going to bring me pleasure today. Live for the moment. This is the self-indulgent type, and this is what democracy encourages. This is this freedom, equality lover. Right? This is a very tolerant type of person too, because he says, "Look, you do. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. You do what you're going to do. Live and let live. It's great." So it's not as if it's entirely negative in that respect. But the problem is that the democratic person refuses to believe that any pleasures are inherently finer than any others. He's a complete egalitarian when it comes to honoring his pleasures with indulgence. So he lives from day to day, gratifying the appetite of the moment, Plato says. Let's look at page 381. In the left-hand column in the center. So this is his description of the democratic type. And so he lives from day to day, gratifying the appetite of the moment. Sometimes he drinks heavily while listening to the flute. We can update this and say, sometimes he smokes weed all day and, listens to hip hop or whatever. Well, at others, he drinks only water and is on a diet. He goes in for keto or one of these fad diets. And yoga. Sometimes he goes in for physical training. Well, there are others in which he is idle and neglects everything. Sometimes he spends his time engaged in what he takes to be philosophy. Gets into Twitter wars with people or whatever about moral principles on the internet. Often, though, he takes part in politics. Again, gets involved in BLM demonstrations. Leaping to his feet and saying and doing whatever happens to come into his mind. If he admires some military man, that is the direction in which he is carried. If some moneymakers, then that is a different one. There is neither order nor necessity in his life, yet he calls it pleasant, free, and blessedly happy, and follows it throughout his entire life. This leads to the first discussion question. How would you evaluate Plato's analysis and critique of democracy and the type of character it produces? Does Plato's analysis and critique apply to modern democracies, as I've been suggesting? Do you see yourself or your friends reflected in Plato's description of the democratic type? Why or why not? Is democracy redeemable from the pitfalls that Plato describes? If so, how? If not, why not? So once again, first discussion question. How would you evaluate Plato's analysis and critique of democracy and the type of character that it produces? Does Plato's analysis and critique apply to modern democracies? Do you see yourself or your friends reflected in Plato's description of the democratic type? Why or why not? Is democracy redeemable from the pitfalls that Plato describes? If so, how? If not, why not? And lastly, in our list, there is the tyrannical type of person, the tyrant, in the tyrannical constitution. Socrates makes the, for us, remarkable observation that tyranny evolved from democracy. Tyranny evolved from democracy. However, Socrates' approach is consistently dialectical here, again, in a way that would be an inspiration for Hegel. The downfall of each constitution, that is the Achilles heel or the internal contradiction, is what Socrates calls its insatiable desire. So we could say each one of these constitutions has sort of at its heart an insatiable desire. And this is expressed in the lover that we see in all these. Of course, even the philosopher is the wisdom lover. So this is the desire, this characteristic. The philosopher has the desire for wisdom, the lover of wisdom, insatiable desire. The honor lover has the insatiable desire for honors and victories. The money lover has the insatiable desire for money and profits. The freedom or equality lover has the insatiable desire for freedom or equality. So each of these constitutions is characterized by its insatiable desire. And in each of these cases, it's the insatiable desire that leads to the downfall. In democracy, the insatiable desire is for freedom, and this also leads to downfall. Paradoxically, the excessive desire for freedom leads to the very opposite of freedom, namely tyranny. Plato's idea is that the drive to obtain ever greater freedom is so powerful that it inevitably leads the democratic personality toward anarchy. He says in a democratic city, even the animals turn to anarchy. He says, at any rate, I'm going to say, and I mean no one who has experienced it would believe how much freer domestic animals are here than in any other city. Sorry, this is page 382 in our text in the bottom of the left-hand column. Female dogs follow the proverb exactly and become like their mistresses. Horses and donkeys are in the habit of proceeding with complete freedom and dignity, bumping into anyone they meet on the road who does not get out of their way. In a democratic city, even the animals refuse to obey their masters, right? Of course, if you're a cat owner, you realize this is the normal case regardless. But this is kind of like Albuquerque, a pit bull in every alleyway. That's Albuquerque. Pooping in your driveway. They run the place. Also, democracy makes citizens overly sensitive. So on 382, he says, this is the top of the right-hand column, do you notice how sensitive they make the citizen's soul, so that if anyone tries to impose the least degree of slavery, they get irritated and cannot bear it, right? You're oppressing me with your microaggressions. That's the democratic way of responding to things. And the great irony is that this immature anarchical peevishness that we sometimes see today in various popular protest movements, especially online, Plato views this as the entree to tyranny. It's the beginning of tyranny. Being tyrannized by people's sensitivities in the name of equality, in the name of avoiding oppression or harm, quote unquote, as we say these days. So the principle by which the greatest unfreedom results from the greatest freedom is a kind of Newtonian principle of political and psychological life. Continuing the same column, he says, excessive action in one direction usually sets up a great reaction in the opposite direction. Sounds almost Newtonian, doesn't it? Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So a push towards extreme anarchical freedom inevitably is going to cause an equal reaction to tyranny. And so we see, right, so often, and this is blatantly apparent in the 20th century, or we should say the whole modern era from the French Revolution onwards, that revolutions in the name of increased freedom often wind up with some kind of dictator or tyrant or some kind of totalitarian communist regime, as in the Soviet Union or Cuba or Nicaragua or wherever it might be, North Korea or Vietnam. You end up having a kind of reaction that ends up imposing an even greater degree of restriction on freedoms of people, ironically. So excessive action in one direction usually sets up a great reaction in the opposite direction. Extreme freedom probably cannot lead to anything but a change to extreme slavery, whether in a private individual or in a city. Think about the irony of this demand for freedom and equality, which on the democratic mind, of course, go along with one another, although there might be a tension there, but leave that to one side. So in the name of this demand for freedom for everybody, the maximum amount of freedom for everybody, everyone becomes afraid and has to walk on eggshells. And instead of reading what's actually printed in a text, has to replace it with the word female dog because someone might complain to the Office of Equal Opportunity if I even say a word, even though it's printed in a respectable text. So you become, your freedom gets restricted. Here we're thinking it's particularly of free speech to begin with. But it's restricted. Why? In the name of freedom. Right? In the name of the greatest opportunity for everyone. In the name of opening up the society for everyone to feel as if they're free. But then they're not free because of the practices that are imposed in the name of freedom. So extreme freedom doesn't lead to anything but a change to extreme slavery, whether in a private individual or in a city. Also, of course, we might think here, Plato might have this in mind, that the more you just indulge yourself, of course, the more you run the risk of becoming addicted to something. And that, of course, is to be an addict to a substance is the greatest form of unfreedom. Tyranny probably does not evolve from any constitution other than democracy, then. The most severe and cruel slavery evolving from what I suppose is the most eminent degree of freedom. And the mechanism by which this happens, in particular, frequently will run through the existence of a class of aimless drones in the city that's always susceptible to being enlisted by a charismatic leader. And we think of examples of modern revolutions. This often will happen in the wake of the of loss in war, where you'll have war veterans returning. Perhaps they're unemployed because the economy has collapsed, and then there's some charismatic leader enlist them in their cause, whether it's a Lenin or a Hitler or whoever it may be. Plato anticipates how cancel culture forms around would-be tyrants. The bottom of page 383 on the left. He says, in a democracy, with few exceptions, it is surely the dominant class, that is the drones. In a democracy with few exceptions, it is surely the dominant class. Its fiercest part does all the talking and acting, while the other settles near the speaker's platform. It buzzes and does not tolerate any dissent. As a result, this class is in charge of everything in such a constitution with few exceptions. This is the Twitter mob, power of the Twitter mob. Then around this core, there are the rich people who are the fodder for the drones. That is the virtue signaling corporations in our society who feed the increasing intolerance of the drones and their Twitter mobs. Of course, Plato's imagining, of course, this isn't happening on Twitter. It's happening in the agora, the central meeting area of the city, where as in the old-fashioned way, you would have someone like a Hitler get up on a soapbox, literally, and give a speech and rouse everyone up and so forth, and then go and, vandalize the property of their enemies and this sort of thing. Nowadays, it's done more electronically, so maybe that's progress. So you have the drones, these dissatisfied, disenfranchised masses led by angry revolutionary leaders. You have the ruling, the wealthy people who are kowtowing to them. And then you have sort of the political establishment. And numerically speaking, these are the largest class in the democracy, but they're easily radicalized by the desperate class because they're weak and cowardly by nature. And so you see, the Lisa Benders, the city councilor of Minneapolis, very easily being pushed to defund the Minneapolis police as a result of public protests, or the way in which university presidents, who shall remain unnamed, often will bend over immediately for student protests of one kind or another, and concede to demands that they themselves probably don't regard as being particularly rational, but nonetheless, out of fear, they allow themselves to get pushed around. And here, I think in the modern era, the paradigmatic example of this kind of idea of a political establishment being destabilized by activist forces and pushed around and intimidated by them would be the Weimar Republic in Germany. And he says, then there are impeachments, judgments, and trials on both sides. Then there are impeachments, judgments, and trials on both. That might sound familiar to someone. And this situation polarizes the political establishment, and under pressure from the anarchists, the revolutionaries, perhaps they really do become oligarchs. And this serves to maximize the contradictions, as 1960s Marxists would say. And so it becomes easier to, demonize the political establishment the more they're cracking down. But of course, they were only driven to crack down in the first place because of the radical demands of the activists. And so the people, in response to the political establishment, will set up one great leader. The drones will, that is, the activists, so Bernie, Bernie, Bernie. And then once the anarchic mob has anointed its leader, it's game on. Once he really does take over a docile mob, he does not restrain himself from shedding a fellow citizen's blood, but by leveling the usual false charges and bringing people into court, he commits murder. And by blotting out a man's life, his impious tongue and lips taste kindred blood. Then he banishes and kills and drops hints about the cancellation of debts and the redistribution of land. And after that, isn't such a man inevitably fated either to be killed by his enemies or to be a tyrant, transformed from a man into a wolf? The last line is the Cersei Lannister line from Game of Thrones. If you play the Game of Thrones, you either win or you die. But here we're describing like a Castro type figure. And Bernie Sanders, thankfully for the United States of America, was only a kind of admirer of Castro. He wasn't a true Castro figure, so we don't have rivers of blood. He didn't actually become a tyrant, but maybe, I don't know, maybe if his time might have come a little bit too late in his life. Maybe that was what the problem was. Or maybe he wasn't a real revolutionary ultimately after all. But regardless, it's shocking, arguably. Of course, you could disagree with any of this, but it's arguably shocking how closely this template that Plato is constructing, of course, a priori, based on some experience, but mostly a priori, millennia ago, seems to match the contemporary situation in many moments, actually, in the last 200 years. So this describes how the tyrant comes to power. The tyrant is swept to power on the shoulders of this activist base of drones who sweep away the political establishment, and it's usually done through a certain degree of violence, intimidation, and bloodshed. And then the tyrant, again, a good example would be a Fidel Castro in Cuba, occupies the throne, and what happens? So finally, Plato turns to the happiness of this man and of the city in which such a creature arises. And at the beginning, the tyrant is all smiles and happy promises, especially the promise to free the people from debt. This is a classic promise of the tyrant, to free the people from debt. You can almost always find on the website of a would-be tyrant some promise to cancel debt. However, once he's dealt with his exiled enemies, the popular leader inevitably becomes a tyrant. And one part of the tyrant's strategy is to increase the tax burden on the people so that they become impoverished and they have to focus all their energies on survival. They don't have time to sit around agitating on the internet anymore. So they can't rise against the tyrant. And the tyrant also is engaging in purges. Most famously, in the 20th century, again, you have Stalin's purges, but all tyrants engage in purges. And he eliminates all the better people because these are the people who are his possible rivals. So then he's faced with a mass of helpless subjects at his mercy. And it doesn't become long before the citizens hate the tyrant. But they can do nothing because they're powerless in the face of the tyrant's powerful bodyguard. Again, this is very typical. You have the SS, first the SA and then the SS in Nazi Germany as Hitler's bodyguard. You had the, in Iran and Iraq, they both had different versions of revolutionary guards around their tyrannical leaders. And the tyrant will have to recruit his bodyguard, not from the masses who now despise him, but from foreigners or from slaves. And so, ironically, on page 386, right-hand column towards the bottom, he says, the people, by trying to avoid the proverbial frying pan of enslavement to free men, have fallen into the fire of having slaves as their masters, and in exchange for the excessive and inappropriate freedom they had before, have put upon themselves the harshest and most bitter slavery to slaves. All right, so this is the second discussion question. Is Plato correct in his argument that democracy's insatiable desire for freedom leads to anarchy and the eventual seizure of control by a tyrant? Is there a way in which this unfortunate outcome could be prevented? Explain your reasoning. So once again, the second discussion question. Is Plato correct in his argument that democracy's insatiable desire for freedom leads to anarchy and the eventual seizure of control by a tyrant? Is there a way in which this unfortunate outcome could be prevented? Explain your reasoning.